Welcome everybody to the third HuMEL meeting, which will be SMILER Plus and virtual participatory meal systems. Sid, if you could go to the next slide, I'll go over some technology stuff really quick and then move on to the meat of the meeting. So we will have a large Q&A section in the middle. So if you could stay muted for now, we will have people ask questions. You can raise your hand using you're in the participant panel and going to the bottom right, there's a raise hand button, and I will call on you to ask if you feel comfortable, you can activate your video and then ask the question. We will also be reading questions in the chat, so if you feel more comfortable putting them there, I will read them out to each of the different panelists. And a good way to do this, since we do encourage people to keep their videos on, is if you can go to the top right, there is a speaker view button, and that will position whoever is speaking as the primary focal point from the video, which is just a nice way to see who's talking and then be able to, it'll bounce back and forth between who's ever talking at that moment, just to see what different people look like. So let's get started. Welcome everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Chris Casper-Riggs. I'm the organizational learning specialist on IDEAL, so I focus primarily on communities of practice and peer-to-peer learning. So I'll go over the agenda, which is very, very brief, but good, robust conversation, and then we can get to the action. So this meeting is being run under the HuMEL banner, which stands for Humanitarian Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning. It's a community of practice that's focused on practical applications of MEL in the humanitarian context. Today, we're going to be focusing on moving meal systems to the virtual context through the lens of the recently renovated SMILER Plus. So Clara Hagens will give us an overview of what SMILER Plus is and how it works through a process map. After that, we have 6 speakers who work in countries around the world, and they will be sharing their SMILER Plus experience recommendations for hosting and implementing virtual meal systems. So I will now hand it over to Clara Hagens, who is the Senior Technical Advisor for MEAL from Catholic Relief Services, and she will kick us off today with an introduction of SMILER Plus. Clara?
Thanks, Chris, and welcome everyone. As Chris noted, I'll provide an overview of SMILER Plus, largely so you have a sense of the meal system development process that our colleagues will refer to when they give their recommendations. Next slide, Sid. Thank you. So just to start with the basics, SMILER Plus is a participatory process that enables teams to develop meal systems which are responsive to context and also contribute to adaptive management. So SMILER Plus builds on initial decisions and project design, and some during startup, to then operationalize, create forms, identify processes, map flow for the meal system itself before implementation. It's promoted as a workshop, often a 5-day workshop, but can be conducted in separate work sessions, for example, and certainly will always be adapted to context. While SMILER Plus is always adapted to context, there are a few aspects that will remain true across different adaptations, and that's what I've highlighted here. SMILER Plus in its current version certainly prioritizes information needs of key stakeholders, including different community members and different local stakeholders in meal system development. Up front in the SMILER Plus sequence, is a session on developing stakeholder communication plans. And through that process, we identify stakeholder information needs and then plan to meet those through various forms of communication. And that forms the basis for many of the meal system components to follow. Core to SMILER Plus is a data flow map, and that data flow map builds on a meal plan, project indicator reference sheets, and other initial design documents to follow monitoring data primarily as it goes from collection through storage, analysis to use, and then ultimately to meet stakeholder information needs as well. A new component in SMILER Plus is through the inclusion of accountability within MEAL and then in SMILER Plus is a session on feedback, complaints, and response mechanisms. So similar to mapping the flow of monitoring data, we map the flow of feedback, complaints, and response through a flow chart and then developing data collection forms, identifying roles and responsibility, and ensuring that that avenue of information also helps to contribute to adaptive management processes, as well as uphold safeguarding policies. Another thing that SMILER Plus does is to embed MEAL within the larger enabling environment and operating environment through identifying roles and responsibilities for MEAL staff and program staff, in our case for CRS and our partners. And after those roles and responsibilities are clarified, we ensure that adequate support and resources are allocated to support staff to implement those roles. And that is then embedded in the larger project detailed implementation plan and other project management systems. Lastly, throughout SMILER Plus, there's a focus on data use, and that's seen sort of up front with stakeholder communication through mapping flow, and then paying particular attention to how teams will summarize and utilize data for ongoing decision-making, accountability, and larger communication. And there's a separate component on learning that uses project learning questions to guide ongoing reflections through implementation. Next slide. So here's the process map that Chris mentioned. And what this does is show the SMILER Plus steps over a typical 3 to 5 year project cycle. So certainly this is an example to be adapted. I want to note for this group in particular that the process would look very different in an emergency response. So we at CRS encourage teams, emergency teams, to use SMILER Plus by calling through the list of MEAL system components, identifying sort of the short list or what's critical up early in the response, developing those in initial work sessions, and then coming to a more traditional SMILER Plus workshop at the time of transition to longer term recovery programming, let's say. This process map itself is a useful resource for understanding SMILER Plus, and that the full version goes through the steps, the MEAL system outputs, key activities, and roles and responsibilities as we progress. Next slide. So in step 1, what we've articulated are the decisions that are needed largely by project management to help determine the parameters for the MEAL system. So here we're validating project design decisions, validating indicator definitions in the MEAL plan, making decisions about channels for feedback, complaints, and response mechanisms, and determining appropriate use of ICT for D, among other sort of initial decisions. At this point, we also ask that project managers with the support from MEAL coordinators plan for successful SMILER workshop sessions. Next slide. So the resources that we've put forward for this step are the SMILER guide overall, and some of you may have been familiar with the earlier SMILER version or ProPac 3 that CRS had developed, and this SMILER guide replaces that. Additionally, there's some templates that project managers would use to determine what MEAL system components are needed given agency and donor requirements and as applicable to context. And then particularly a workshop planning tool, which supports, well, clarifies the decisions that need to be made and documents those for use in following steps. Next slide. So in step 2, the SMILER workshop facilitator, in a traditional normal context, if you will, would hold about 5-day workshop with CRS and partner staff, MEAL and sectoral leads as well, to develop, draft the MEAL system components, including data collection tools, reporting formats, with the idea that after the workshop, those drafts are reviewed, translated, field tested before they're finalized. Next slide. So, sorry, just prior, thank you. So a very useful resource for this step that's new in this version is to have a facilitation guide that provides the overall structure for 10 sessions to develop required MEAL system components with objectives, key messages, suggested group processes, and then also a series of quality checks so that as the group develops initial drafts, they can stop, reflect, and improve upon initial drafts as they go through the session. So there are just a few of the templates posted here on the left-hand side for kind of a visual of what's created through the SMILER Plus process. And I would highlight as well that as we go through these, as we go through each session, there are always action plan items that are added in so that the MEAL system development can be finalized after the workshop. Next slide. So launch is identified as a separate step so that there's particular attention given to communicating the scope of the MEAL system to stakeholders, so the expectations and understanding of their role, contributions, and benefits are clear, and also to train staff and volunteers so that they are able to fulfill their roles and responsibilities in a quality meal system. Next slide. This step is led largely by the meal coordinator in our process, and the meal coordinator can refer back to what was put into that action plan during the workshop, and then also the support and resource needs that were identified in the enabling environment session to guide how time and activities are structured to support staff in this training and communication stage. Next slide. So here's the meal cycle in itself in terms of collect, analyze, and use data. What we are supporting in the SMILER Plus guide here is just to ensure that on a regular basis, of course, data use is prominent in the system, but the teams take an opportunity to reflect upon, revise, and improve the meal system during implementation. And that, as needed, reinforcing trainings are provided to staff, any gaps in data quality, et cetera, are addressed. And the resources for this stage are largely within, well, certainly meal content in the project DIP and all of the outputs that SMILER Plus has created in earlier steps. Next slide. So now that's the background we wanted to provide, and then frame for you some recommendations that have come from our internal reflection on, great, we have this approach to meal system development that it really hinges on interaction between partner staff, CRS staff, meal staff, and program staff working together to create these meal system components. In the virtual environment, how is that going? What adaptations have we had to make? How are we continuing to build ownership and engage participants in a virtual setting? So luckily, we've had several recent experiences of adapting SMILER Plus in virtual settings, come together to reflect on those and have a series of initial recommendations we'd like to share out for you as food for thought in terms of how you adapt your own meal systems, and also for further engagement and ideas that can contribute to really overall our shared processes. So as Chris said, we'll start with, we'll go through individual recommendations and have time for question and answer following each. I really look forward to your contributions to this discussion, and thank you for this opportunity to share SMILER Plus.
Thanks, Clara. So we are going to be going to our first presenter, who is Reina from the Philippines. And just as a reminder, she will do a quick presentation and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So feel free to drop questions in the chat box or raise your hand if you have, whenever you think of a question, and I will work through and call on you, and then you can ask your question. So I will hand it over to Reina.
Thank you, Chris. My name is Rainy Catherine Rala. I work as a meal officer for CRS Philippines. We are currently providing COVID-19 support specific to shelter and wash to vulnerable IDPs in Southern Philippines to reach 48,000 people or 8,000 households in 4 provinces, 10 municipalities, and 50 barangays or communities for a duration of 6 months only. CRS has partnered with 3 local organizations in different locations. So in reference to our experience specific to our project in the Philippines, which implemented SMILER Plus remotely due to the COVID-19 situation here, it is recommended that participation for SMILER Plus sessions be varied, taking advantage of the virtual settings to include core program staffs or sectoral leads and local partner organizations who express interest to contribute and learn. Commonly, in usual face-to-face SMILER events, core program team members and a few of the partner organization staffs are mostly required to participate. Additionally, if a project is being implemented with a partner organization, they are expectedly one of the users of the meal systems once it is in place as a result of the SMILER Plus. Conducting SMILER Plus events for a project has sparked interest among other partner staffs. For some who are not required to participate in the SMILER Plus sessions. For example, one partner team member shared that some of their staffs are interested to learn further of the project's meal system as they do not have any idea yet what is the system all about. So instead of responding that we only require certain staffs and partner staffs to join, we open the session to other partner staffs who mostly goes daily to communities to implement the project activities. For example, in the introductory session of the SMILER Plus, core project team members participated in the session. Succeeding sessions, discussion on, like for example, project meal requirements, specifically discussing on performance management plans, had more participation, which also required further discussion on when to deliver and what are expected to achieve for a certain period of time for the project. On the other hand, sessions on, for example, data flow map and data collection tools may have unique group of participants for team members working for specific sectors. Like for in our case, we have wash and shelter. Then we have another separate discussion with the meal team. Another is session on feedback and response mechanism was generally discussed with first with core CRS project team member, and then with partner staff members, including those staffs who were also interested to join in. Then a separate feedback and response mechanism rollout discussion was held separately as well with the project meal team. So varying participation for specific SMILER Plus sessions, which were held remotely in several sessions, has prompted interest and participation to specific group of project team members, particularly with partner staff, since we are implementing this one with local organizations here in Southern Philippines. This is the Philippine experience of conducting remote SMILER Plus here, due to the limited mobility of staffs to be in one physical location. Should there be any questions, Chris, I'll be happy to respond to it. Salamat and thank you.
Thank you, Rainey. If anyone has any questions, then now would be a good time to ask them. I can actually start it off. I'm curious with the different participatory groups that you're mentioning, did you find that there were challenges bringing some of the people who don't have as much familiarity with meal systems up to speed quicker to work on these different sessions, or did you have any particular way of doing that?
For the initial presentation of, like for example, the terms that we use here in CRS, for the main sessions, there were a lot of inquiries like for the partners because majority of them are very new. But then later on, as we go on with the discussion, especially when CRS staff raises their questions on certain things, they also pose some, or they also share some inquiries as well, so that it will be more, they'd be more enlightened, and it's explained in a simpler term. So what happened was, since some of them were not required to participate, but then even if that's the case, they showed interest that they wanted to learn our system, since majority of the staffs are very new. And then later on, we divided it into small groups, and then I had a separate remote discussion as well with them.
Great, thank you. If anyone else has any questions for Rainey, now would be a good time to ask them.
I do. Raina, could you talk a little bit about just the number of people you had in these different groups? Did you find that there was an ideal size given the virtual setting and the content of your discussions?
For the ideal size, of course, we wouldn't feel that because it's a remote session. But in our 7 steps design, we recommended who are required to participate for the core groups from CRS side and for the partner organizations. But then later on, we realized that smaller sessions could be helpful as well, discussing from the bigger group to smaller groups, like for example focusing on the partners. It was more helpful for them to understand our system, especially that we had a lot of technical meal jargons that should be simplified on their end, since they are going to be one of the users. So that's very important to have a separate sessions with our partners here, since we are working with 3 different local partners.
If there are, we'll give it a little bit to see if anyone has any questions. Otherwise, we might let Reina go, because I know it's very late in the Philippines and we appreciate her
Yes.
staying. Here we have a question from Phoebe. Did you have any sessions that brought everyone together, say at the beginning and end, so everyone sees the bigger picture? So sort of, did you have introduction and culmination sessions?
At the beginning, yes, we have a bigger session. Then the discussion on, like, for example, when we discuss the performance management plan or the meal plan or specific to the indicators, we also had a bigger session. But I had a separate session, like, for example, for the meal staffs and for the social mobilization officers to understand the objectives of the project and what's the relation of this one when they go to the field and what are expected from them. So yes, it's very important that at the end of these sets of session, they'll be able to they will be able to see a bigger picture. So it's not like you have several session and then you can actually you expect that the rest of the group will be able to see that right away. So it's a work on progress, given the situation that we are conducting these sessions remotely. So from time to time, we have smaller discussions, but at times we use the face-to-face method, since some of the organizations are very near to the CRS office. So we sometimes we meet and then just follow COVID-19 protocols.
Thank you, and I see we have a couple more questions, and I think we might actually be able to circle back to those later, but we are now out of time for Rainey. So I wanted to thank Rainey. I know it is late, so if you feel free to log off.
I can
Sorry.
chat in the response.
Yeah, and if you want to, I think, yeah, we might get, yeah, if you want to chat in the response, that would be great. So we are now going to move on to Nancy Dorian.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. And thanks for the opportunity to share Northeast Nigeria's lessons learned on our virtual SMILER Plus. We started our new program a few months ago on July 1st. And so we really relied on the community of practice out there to inform what we did. So it's nice to contribute back to this conversation. For a quick introduction, again, my name is Nancy Duran. I am the program manager for emergency wash and shelter in Northeast Nigeria. The program I'm going to speak about is for a 12-month, 3.5 million multi-sectorial emergency program. It is a protracted emergency, so there's been a few different phases of this program. So just in terms of how we defined what we were going to do for the SMILER Plus, a little bit of a background. We had some challenges. The one, as you all know, is the COVID-19. The second one is, as it's only an emergency program of 12 months, we needed to make sure we moved quickly with some sort of SMILER workshops so that we could have effective data collection, meal systems in place to support the program. The last challenge we faced was also that we had limited meal staff availability. This was due to a myriad of different situations in this emergency context. So I'm really giving you the perspective of SMILER Plus from heavily supported by program team. So the recommendation that I'm going to be providing today is really about how did we efficiently and effectively prepare for a SMILER Plus such that could be online, virtual, and effectively done rapidly. So the first step was really to begin designing the workshop, was to hold a 3-day virtual lessons learned workshop. And this was really held with a multitude of stakeholders from the operations team, partner teams, and also as well the program team. This lessons learned workshop really provided us with valuable assessments and action items to inform the SMILER Plus. So we came out with specific areas in terms of communication, data collection, and reporting mechanisms that worked, that didn't work, or needed to be improved. The next step was to hold a coordination meeting to run through the meal design document checklist. Those were some of the tools that Clara was mentioning. Those were extremely helpful to us to identify what documents we had, what documents we needed, and what we needed to revise. From this, we decided, we also took a look at the SMILER Plus facilitation manual and all of the tools and presentation templates of the SMILER Plus system. And we identified that we wanted to streamline the 10 sessions into only 7 sessions. As we were program team driven, we also added a unique session that was going to complement some of the iterative progress sessions of the SMILER Plus. So we added one on workflow. This really helped us to begin to define sort of the actions and all the different data points in terms of each one of our field activities. So for each session, we had 4 program team facilitators. The main facilitator was in charge of designing and managing the session. They also developed the presentation and framework documents to be used within the SMILER Plus. So this was all done before the SMILER Plus happened. If they needed to engage some other teams on what these documents look like, they did that again beforehand. The 3 other facilitators managed small breakout sessions where there were groups of 4 to 6 individuals. They all had templates to fill out during these breakout sessions. So they were working on different components of the SMILER documents. And then they had to complete these forms and then report back to the larger groups. Oftentimes this was taking a look at an existing document and having discussions around it and then working on some SWOT analysis. To unpack this just a little bit further, if you take a look at just one session identified in the SMILER Plus, that's the data collection tool. Again, one of the program teams before the SMILER Plus started up developed a workflow framework that was then taken into the SMILER Plus. In a unique session, it was then developed in great detail by a collective whole. And from that, we were able to go into data flow analysis and then data collection tools. So that was really helpful to understand the interconnectedness of all the meal tools with the program tools. So just to finalize some of the points on preparing documents and materials before a SMILER Plus. The pros are really the program team. There was a lot of capacity building that happened with that, and also ownership of meal tools. I think Reina definitely mentioned this as well. The second one is there's a direct input of programmatic field context into the document. So there's a direct connection and understanding of different steps and activities that are happening in the field and what's happening on the meal side. So there was a really, I would say the data collection became more reality-based. Some of the cons for us, just to let you know, it wasn't all easy peasy. The program team, since they were mostly the ones that, involved in this, had limited time for documentation. So we really tried to have everything documented within the sessions. But, and there was about, let's say, 5 days, 5 hours each day. But we had very limited time and we weren't able to finish all the documentation at the end of each day. And as well, it was really important to have more engagement by the meal team, and that just wasn't possible at that time. So with that, I conclude my quick presentation, and if there are any questions, I'd be glad to respond.
Thank you, Nancy. I guess I can ask a quick follow-up question while we wait for some questions to trickle in. Why was it hard to get the meal team involved in the components of this?
So we are working in Northeast Nigeria, and there is a protracted emergency. So we have actually a meal manager on our team and a meal officer. The meal officer was taken off to assist in a higher priority program. And then also our meal manager had a unfortunate situation in the family. So they were gone for a couple of months.
Okay.
And those things,
Unforeseen.
in terms of the emergency, we can't really wait to have quality meal tools for 2 to 3 months. So we decided to move ahead.
And how did you overcome that obstacle?
Well, it was really about having the program team design and facilitate all of the sessions. So again, I really do think that the program team-led lessons learned that we held before the SMILER was critical to that, because we had an assessment of all the different sectors and identified different challenges that we were facing in previous programs. So from that, we were able to clearly identify what we needed to work on in a SMILER.
Great. We will wait a little bit here to see if there are any questions for Nancy before we move on to our next presenter. Lloyd?
Yeah, Nancy, could you contrast just the difference between when you were prior to COVID preparing an in-person workshop versus now with COVID where you're preparing all these system components in advance of? Like, could you just contrast that experience for your team, and were there benefits to this approach to drafting these components in advance? Or do you think, post-COVID, you'll really revert back to being more of a collaborative in-person activity? I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, and I think Raina also spoke to this a little bit. The SMILER Plus virtual, I was going into it a little bit hesitantly. I'm very much a face-to-face workshop kind of person. I've done a lot of community engagement exercises in many different forms. But having done this and having the amount of collaboration and connection to the material that was happening on the SMILER Plus was much more than I've seen in a face-to-face SMILER. I think there was also something about, even though we were doing 5 hours a day for 5 days, there was the ability to potentially just, we had breaks, periodic breaks, and you were able to get water, you were able to, look out the window. And sometimes in a SMILER face-to-face, when you're in the same room, you just can't turn off at all. So long story short, I also felt like there was as Raina mentioned, there was a lot more contribution from many different people. So we were able to really bring in a lot of different people to demonstrate how the different meal components link directly to program activities, to their activities in the field. And I think that was really key in terms of those later sessions when we were talking about data collection tools, because that's the ones that they actually do. So, in sort of conclusion, I think I would really promote actually doing the SMILER Plus virtual. That being said, it's also great to have a lot of fun with it too. So we did periodically have DJs that would, during pauses, we also had games that we did. So it was really looked at as a team building exercise. When you usually have a face-to-face SMILER, you only have that core group usually there. But when we had this larger group of people, we were able to also consider this a team building exercise. Sorry, that was a little bit long-winded.
No, that's okay. That's really helpful. I think it's always nice to hear when you have those successes and you feel like something went a lot better than you thought it did. So thank you, Nancy, for presenting and answering some questions. We will now move on to Jovens, who will who will go through his presentation from Haiti. Did we lose Jovens? We might have lost him. Looks like he's not online anymore. So maybe, why don't we move to the next one and we'll see if he joins back up and we can circle back to him. So instead, we will be moving to Aaron.
Jovens did just pop back up.
All right, so let's circle back right now to Jovens.
Okay.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Jovens.
Okay, sorry about the connection. I lost connectivity. Yes, thank you, Chris. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Manager for CRS80, and I'm happy to participate in this webinar so to share my recommendations based on 80 experience conducting virtual SMILER. As you probably know, conducting a virtual workshop requires a lot of preparation and efforts. And in that sense, to be successful in a virtual SMILER workshop, it is important to consider the participant engagement during the virtual sessions. That being said, prior to the workshop, I highly recommend that a good preparation be made so to engage everyone. And to do so, it is important that we prepare for different logistics. And based on the recent experience in conducting a virtual SMILER workshop here in Haiti for a COVID-19 response project, I can state the following. First, it is important to hold the meeting prior to the workshop so to orient the participant on the meeting software that will be used. It could be Teams, Zoom, or any other software. But the reason is that the participants are not always familiar with the meeting software that will be used. And here in Haiti, we use Teams, and prior to the workshop, we make sure that everybody knows the basics of the software, such as how to mute, unmute the microphone, how to activate, deactivate the camera, how to post questions in the chat, how to request to speak by raising hands, etc. Second, it is important to create a landing page for all workshop items, such as the agenda, the background project documents like proposal, failure of change, the draft mail document, as mentioned by Nancy, like stakeholder communication plans, and any other key references. The reason is to make sure that everything is in one single place, so to avoid delay by accessing the documents during the session, and also to add any other documents that will be developed or finalized during the workshop. This was super helpful for us during our SMILER because we use a simplified agenda to conduct the workshop in a very short period, and any delay would affect significantly our timeline. Third, it is important also to identify participatory whiteboard software like Miro, etc. In our case, we didn't use those kind of software during our workshop. Instead, we used the chat room discussions so to get the participation of everyone. But we have realized that the use of a participatory whiteboard software would be more suitable, especially when it comes to design the data flow map with the inputs of everyone. Fourth, I think this is the last thing I will mention. It is important to create a producer role to support facilitators. As you know, as a facilitator, when you are presenting, you need to be focused on the slides. And to be able to do so, it is essential to have someone to help in posting polls or links in the chats, to support with questions, to manage transitions to breakout session, etc. And with that approach, it will be easier to manage the sessions by addressing most of the questions and to respect the time allowed. Overall, that was my recommendation, and I'll be happy to answer your questions, if any. Thank you. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Jovens. That was very helpful. So again, if you want to raise your hand to ask a question or just type it in the group chat, then I will relay it to Jovens. You can also just unmute yourself if you feel comfortable in asking that. So yeah, I actually had a question around, were there any, you mentioned that you use Teams, and I think someone had asked a question about what software you chose, and I don't know how you came to that decision to use Teams, but were there any big hiccups that you had to overcome in the trying to get this all set up for the virtual sessions, maybe that you weren't prepared for?
Yes, thank you, Chris. We use Teams because Teams, this is the software that we use in the agency here in Haiti. So we use Teams for any meeting that we are conducting. So that's why we didn't use any other software. But when we were using Teams for that workshop, we were not very familiar to how to create the breakout sessions by creating new channel, things like that. It was a little bit challenging, but we learned from that, and then we can say that now we are more comfortable using Teams by creating new channels to manage better the breakout sessions. So overall, it was good, but the big issue that we had during the workshop, it was a question of connectivity, because you know that here, unfortunately, in our case, we have sometimes we have a electricity issue, and then sometimes people lost their connection, and then we have to wait for a few minutes to see them connect again. So that was the big issue during the session. But overall, we manage very well the teams.
That's great, thank you. And that's a very helpful tip too from Aaron around Teams. I know that we on Ideal use Teams and have the same problem. So just to make sure that you plan ahead and make sure people have access to all the documents, because that can be a really big hurdle. I actually have another follow-up question if no one else does. This is might be a little bit tricky, but what was the biggest kind of, to what Nancy talked about, how she found it to be she ended up appreciating it a lot more than she thought. Was there any technological aspects that you realized really enhanced the participation of your members that you might not have predicted happening before you started working through the sessions?
Sorry, Chris, sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question, so it was like a little bit cutting the voice. Can you say it again, please?
Yeah, of course. Just were there any unexpected benefits that you might not have seen or thought about before you started doing these sessions from a technology side?
Okay, yes. Well, thank you. That's a very good question. So what we realized is that for the project that we conduct in the SMILER, most of the staff were new, and they didn't know anything about the use of those technologies. But we realized that the use of Teams increased significantly the engagement of people. Because sometimes when conducting in-person workshop, sometimes people participate in a specific session and then they don't participate in other. But we realized that like 100% participation of people in this workshop. So people wanted to know more about Teams. They wanted to participate more in the online workshop, and then this increased significantly their participation. So specifically for the new staff. So that was amazing.
That's great. Yeah, it sounds like this process really democratizes all the processes and lets everyone participate a lot more than they might have normally. So that's great.
Yeah.
I think we have time for maybe one more question, and if not, then we can just move on to the next person. Let's go ahead and thank you so much, Jovens. That was really great. Really helpful to hear your experiences in Haiti and getting the good participation in virtual sessions. So we can move on now to Aaron, who's going to be talking about the Cascading Project. So Aaron.
Hi, good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this. We really appreciate getting to learn from different people's questions as well. I'm the director of a project called Cascade. It's a global project. And so our meal planning had to involve people from across a number of different time zones, which added a different type of challenge. What we did differently was really to plan out short sessions, really focused on just one topic at a time, 1 to 2 hour sessions. We did, like many of the other speakers, draft components in advance. Each participant needed to review that in their own time prior to our short meetings. And then we spent time discussing the areas that needed more debate or discussion. So that allowed us to really hone in on those areas that were going to create a lot more debate, a lot more active participation, and just review in a simplified way those components that were pretty basic. We also really needed to focus our agenda down on what we must do together versus what would be nice to do together. So those were some of the major changes that we made in terms of the way that we planned this. And the must do together versus nice to do together just kept being honed further and further each day after each session, because we'd realize, okay, we didn't quite get necessarily as far as we thought we would. Let's cut even further what we were planning for the next session and really focus it down. So it was a constant struggle to make sure that we were really making it manageable and bite-sized enough for the amount of time that people had to focus. Because again, working across so many different time zones, you're also trying to coordinate different schedules. And you can't have a 5-hour session with people across that many different time zones. So those were some of the challenges that we were dealing with. But we found that those shorter sessions were able to help us focus, and planning those also helped us to focus on what were really the key ingredients.
Thanks, Aaron. That was really helpful. So something that occurs to me, and we can wait and see if we have some more questions, but did you find that by having shorter sessions over a longer period, it might have allowed people to reflect on what had happened and maybe even provide a little bit of a greater insight into the processes? Because I know that when I'm in a session that lasts 5, 6, 7 hours, it's often hard to reflect critically on what we've gone through. It can become a blur. But when you have these shorter sessions over a longer time, you might be able to critically consider what you've been talking about. So did you have any experiences like that, or any kind of insights into what sort of side benefits of spreading these sessions out?
Definitely. Having also the time to really review some of the components ahead of time gave the participants, I think, a bit more of critical insights. They were really focusing on those things that they had more comments about, that they really wanted to debate further. But also having the time in between. We had a couple of situations where someone would say, oh, well, I was just in this other meeting where we discussed using a barometer like this, and could we do that instead of the type of question that we were planning here? So that was particularly helpful for someone to have had an experience in between to think, oh, that could apply to Cascade as well. So that was something we really appreciated. And also, as part of our startup workshop, something that other participants have, other speakers have brought up, the fact of being virtual allows for almost 100% response rates. And I love facilitating in person. And I like the energy that you get from seeing how participants are engaging. And I was really, really skeptical about how it would be virtually. But we used Mentimeter quite a bit. And using a polling software or a polling opportunity like that, you can ask a question to your group of participants, and get 100% of people giving their opinion on that question. If you're in a live workshop, you might be able to have people raise their hands. You might be able to use sticky notes. It would take a lot longer. Another side benefit is that a lot of what you've done is documented already. It saves you so much time in having to go back and, you know, redocument everything, write up things that were on sticky notes, etc. You've already got it right there. You can record. You also have the chat. And a lot of those side conversations that happen in the chat are things that you would miss out on as a facilitator. Because say if I were sitting next to you, Chris, I might have, you know, a clever comment that I would whisper to you and nobody else would hear it. But in this chat, everyone gets to benefit from whatever it is that the person thought of in that moment. So I think that's a neat side benefit to these virtual meetings.
Yeah, thanks. I know that I'm often someone who whispers clever things to people next to me in meetings, so it's nice that everyone gets to hear my, you know, sometimes sassy, sometimes clever remarks to everyone. So if there's any other questions for Aaron, that would be Lloyd. Looks like he has a question. Lloyd.
Well, I'm interested in the include document review in the agenda. Could you just walk through the practicalities of that, what it looked like, how long it was, just how that functioned in general?
So we planned basically a series of sessions that were focused on a specific topic. And prior to that topic, there was pre-reading. So the participants needed to have pre-read those specific components that we were going to be touching on that day that were already pre-drafted. And in many cases, actually probably in all cases, we had left comments throughout the document for discussion, so that it was clear this is not a done deal. You're not just reviewing something that's already been decided. We want inputs on these various components that we're still debating and not sure about. So that opened up, and it was more like soliciting specific comments on particular areas that were of interest for us to discuss further as a group. So yeah, just like you would send out anything for review, but making it very clear through the comments that you leave throughout the document how open you are to changes and suggestions, so that people don't feel like they're reviewing a finalized thing, but that they're just at a starting point that they're helping you move forward.
And was there ever a time where like you literally just gave people 10 or 15 or 20 minutes during a session to just sit and review it kind of on their own, but while you stayed on virtually on? Like, yeah, as I read that, that's kind of how I had interpreted it. So that's what I was wondering.
We were hoping in an ideal world that people would have completely done this prior, but what happened in real life is much like what you're saying. In some cases, it became clear that not everyone had really read, you know, a certain level of detail. So we did say, let's all take a minute, look at what's there. We'll come back in 5 minutes and discuss it, you know, looking specifically at, say, the detailed definition or something like that. So as, you know, I think it was Jovens who pointed it out very well, that you have got to do your best to engage early and make sure that people come prepared. But if they don't come prepared, you do need a fallback plan. Otherwise, you won't get to where you need to go. So I think taking the time to say, okay, we're all focused on this specific area, please read this, sharing your screen so they know exactly where to go. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Aaron. So let's go ahead and move on to our next presenter, Clara, who will be in for a junior, but she's going to be doing a recommendations from his experiences in the Central African Republic.
Thank you, Chris. Just first of all, I would like to appreciate the opportunities that people voice that have arisen from, if you will, this challenging transition to virtual. And that's just, I think, really neat to see. I mean, certainly we're not blind to the challenges, but so many neat opportunities have arisen. So I think that's great. This is a project that was a Food for Education project in Togo, and the team conducted a virtual SMILER Plus over the summer. I'm going to speak on behalf of them a bit. I'm certainly without some of the details that would be helpful, but I think the recommendation can come through in any case. I know that there were a lot of challenges with engagement, particularly in this SMILER Plus. But one thing that seemed to go well was the adaptation of existing materials to the online environment. So in particular, given that someone had drafted the meal system components prior to the sessions, instead of using the facilitator guide as is, what the facilitators could do would be to look at the objectives and the key messages to frame the work, and then go nearly straight to the quality checks that are included. So as I mentioned in the process map, the facilitator manual for each of the outputs includes 7 to 10 quality checks, so that we don't go through kind of rote meal system component development. We stop to say, wait a minute, are we really hitting on what makes this fantastic? And importantly here, have we connected these different components together so they are in sync, so they build on each other? So another opportunity I'd like to present here, in addition to using those quality checks now to revise and validate earlier drafts, is that we can think about what packages of meal system components participants should look at together, so that when they, let's say that an earlier system component will then contribute to a latter, we have the opportunity to iterate and say, you've seen this is going to come later, look how this turns out. Is there anything that we want to do differently earlier on to make sure that everything builds together, works together? So what I'm twinning here is not just using the quality checks as is, but also seeing how we can maybe refer to different system components as we reflect on quality during the sessions. One thing I do want to note is that it really is a big ask for meal staff or whoever is tasked with developing these components in advance. So the facilitation materials, I think to some degree, can be a useful reference for those individual work sessions, but that's maybe still a challenge that we haven't fully addressed, and kind of the right way to allocate resources and time for the person tasked with developing those components in advance. Over for questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Clara. I'm curious, there was a question earlier, and I wonder how this fits in, about what the process is like for getting local partners to buy in and use the SMILER Plus system. So I was just curious if you had any thoughts around both, when you revise and validate the different components, do you get buy-in from the local partners? Is there kind of a collaborative process to work through that? And how do you get their buy-in for something like SMILER Plus?
So SMILER Plus is promoted as an approach that incorporates partner participation throughout. What I think really varies is who's able to attend, have the right staff been hired by all organizations to contribute in the right way, build out ownership through the process, and then thinking about latter steps in terms of launch, making sure the meal system is communicated throughout the larger partner project team. So partner participation is promoted as part of participatory nature of SMILER Plus. I think to Rainey's point earlier on, it was often hard when we wanted to keep our groups down to 12 to 15 in person, and there'd be someone who's really interested to learn more, but then you're worried about group numbers and the rest. So if anything, the transition online, I think, has opened, as she stated, more doors for folks interested to join individual sessions. But just to underline, yes, partner participation is inherent in the SMILER Plus process, thus kind of our anticipated challenges we've been working to address in terms of maintaining engagement and ownership as we go.
Thank you. Yeah, it looks like Lloyd has another question.
All sorts of questions for me. Clara, could you walk through, as I see quality checks, could you walk through like just an illustrative example of what that was in practice? Like, what did it look like to administer a quality check or and to enforce it, and just what were the dynamics at play there within a team and maybe sub or partners? Just be interested to hear how that works, especially in a virtual environment per se.
Yeah, so the way that it's structured, sort of in any case, virtual or in person, is that the process to develop, there'd be kind of group work to draft components, consolidation likely of different components, and then once the draft has been kind of consolidated, different peer groups have shared out for review, there would be a reflection on the quality checks sort of all at once in most cases to say, is this not so much on complete, but is there cohesion? is the level of detail consistent across? Have we considered, say, in the stakeholder communication plan, have we considered different perspectives within the community, not just the community overall? Let's say maybe one within the data flow map would be to make sure that we're aligning communication and use with what's already noted in the stakeholder communication plan. Importantly, I think we're not just looking at completeness of the component, but trying to get at, and actually I'll take a second to pull up maybe some good examples during the next recommendation, but we're looking at kind of what makes that a valuable MEAL component itself. So the guide is supposed to, in a paragraph, convince readers of why you develop A, B, or C component. And then the quality checks should pull that out to make sure it's not just check the box, but something that's really going to add value as we go forward.
Great, thank you, Clara. So I think we can go ahead and move on to our last presenter. Last but definitely not least, Suleimanu, who will be presenting his recommendation.
Hello, thank you for giving me the floor and giving me the opportunity to share this experience with you. I am Suleimanu, Country MEAL Coordinator for Cameroon, CRS. So we had the experience of developing our SMILER virtual session during the COVID-19 period, coupled with insecurity in the project area. And the project had to be implemented both by CRS and partners, Caritas, that are in the field. So we have different people that have to be involved in the same SMILER workshop and that have to be conducted online. Post-workshop assignment is already part of the SMILER Plus process even in the normal situation. And now during the virtual workshop, it increases and the importance of the post-workshop assignment starts increasing. Simply because sometimes we don't have too much time online, we have internet challenges and we have other issues, and there are so many things that we decide to do it offline or to do it after the workshop. So this makes the post-workshop assignments a critical phase for the finalization of the different tools and documents that we have to design during all our planning. If we don't do it very well, we are going to spoil all the efforts that we did during the implementation. And I'm going to frame in 4 main recommendations the lessons that we learned from our experience in Cameroon on how to really organize that final phase of post-workshop assignment. First of all, the first recommendation is targeting the suitable people for the task, because the team leader or the person in charge of a post-assignment should have a very good understanding of the subject. For example, in our project, we decided, for example, that the MEAL assistant, for example, with good IT skills, who will be even the data manager of the project, can be the best person to continue finalizing, for example, the data flow maps. Meanwhile, the accountability officer of the project was the person in charge of leading the team who will finalize the FRM worksheet. Also, the project manager, who knows better the contract with the donor and so on, was the best person, for example, to finalize the reporting format and the reporting deadlines and so on. So there are some tasks that really look like some people within the project that you can identify. I'm not saying that the other people will not be part of the team, but there are some key people that will have to lead some key post-workshop assignment. Second, we have to improve the readiness of the people by informing those people first that they will be part of the post-workshop assignment for this specific topic. Because we noticed that those who were informed just at the end of the session that they will be in charge of, let us say, finalizing this tool and this tool, it is just at that period that they're starting becoming more interested, asking more questions and trying to understand. But if they have in mind that they are going to be the one finalizing this document, they listen to the presentations, keeping in mind that they need information, they are seeking for more information, and they really, they improve on their readiness to do the post-workshop assignment. This leads us to the third recommendation that we have also noticed, that we should ensure during our session that we have enough information to finalize the work, finalize the post-workshop assignment, because sometimes we keep a lot of time discussing. Some of my predecessors have already mentioned that we can come with the documents that were prepared before, but when it comes like that, there is a lot of discussion now that we conduct to agree on this document. And if we don't care, we will take a long time discussing but not finding an agreement, and the person doing the post-workshop to finalize the document will not finally know which was the final decision that has to be taken, or what was finally decided. So please, we have to balance between having enough information and agreeing on everything during the session that we are conducting, so that we provide enough tools and enough information to the team that will be finalizing any document that we have. This is a key point. And the last one, which is not the least, is now about preparing the next steps for the post-workshop assignment by clarifying and documenting expectations for each assignment. We know that there is a next steps at the end of the SMILER session that we have to do, but it's the opportunity for us to clarify exactly so that each person knows that from my post-workshop assignment that they are giving me, I have this task to do, I have this task to accomplish, and they are expecting this, and even the deadline and everything should be clearly set. So this is the fourth point that is also very important on wrapping on the different recommendations that we have noticed during our SMILER, and that really helped us to improve. And that's the way we are going to do if we had to repeat that virtual session again. Some of those recommendations are not only important for the virtual ones, they are even also important even for the face-to-face SMILER that we conduct. They still remain important. So summarily, this is the experience and the recommendations that we wanted to share with you. Feel free to ask more questions. I'm available to provide in-depth view or in-depth explanations if necessary. Over to you, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Soleimani. That was really great. Those were some fantastic recommendations, and we appreciate you even in a low bandwidth environment turning on your camera to see you. So we can give it a second to see if there are any questions. I know that I have a question, but let's see if there's anyone else who has a question first. So Phoebe, she says she's a bit nervous about the, so I'll just read her comment. The post-SMILER Plus workshop action plan was heavier than previous workshops. She's a bit nervous about that. She's wondering if you could comment further on the timeline for the post-SMILER actions and how they went.
Yes, the comment that I want to give there for our own experience is that we use one of the advices that were already given by one of my predecessors, which was splitting the sessions across many days. For example, we decide, for example, that, okay, let us conduct one session today, and, or let us conduct 2 sessions today, and we are not going to have any session tomorrow. So people will have time, for example, to work on something tomorrow, they can clean it, and now coming for the next section, for example, they have had some time. So splitting the different session across time that was already recommended by a previous presenter was one of the key measures that we have applied in our system, and that really helped. And after this one, we know that there were some things that needed really more time. It needed a refined work, and honestly, we gave them enough time to do it. But they were really helped from our side. They were really helped by the fact that before the post-workshop, we also applied the principle of preparing materials, preparing something, suggesting something from the team before coming to the plenary session. So before starting, we already had something that looks like a draft. During the sessions, we took most of our time on presenting it, discussing it, and trying to refining, agreeing on something. And that is something now that made a bit less heavier the final post-workshop assignment that we have to do. But if we don't do it that way, we will have a lot of work to do at the end. So those are the few measures that we took from our side to really decrease the workload that we will have for the final session. I don't know if this helps. Thank you, and over.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. And that actually, her comment actually feeds kind of into my question, which is, you know, after you go through after maybe a year, is there a pause and reflect around how the SMILER Plus process went, and any recommendations you might be able to feed to other people who are going through this process, especially when they're planning for the continuity of the meal system after the initial SMILER Plus workshop?
Yes, I don't know if I didn't get the question very well, but I framed the 4 recommendations into what I've already presented in terms of targeting the right people to do the work, improving the readiness of those people by informing them first that they will be part of the team, ensuring during the presentations that we agree on what needs to be done and what they are going to do at the end, and finally clarifying and documenting exactly what are our expectations from each assignment. So maybe I didn't get the question very well. I can still get back to the person if I have more clarification on the question. Over.
Yeah, I guess I was just trying to ask if maybe a year after you hold the first workshop, if you had a chance to pause and reflect either yourself or as a team on how things had gone and if there's any things you'd like to improve on.
Chris, I could jump in on that a bit. I think that we aren't
Sure.
promoting as much a reflection on the process, although that could certainly be sort of at the end of the workshop and wonderful to do. But we are, as Aaron noted, on a quarterly basis, sort of reviewing, seeing if any gaps seem to be arising from the meal system and reflecting on data. And then we promote a more in-depth check on meal system quality on an annual basis. And for us, that can be part of kind of our project management standard approach, also related to our kind of self-assessment on meal requirements. We don't have a sort of a standalone tool that's used across the agency for that check, but there are many different ways that teams approach that. And it's more, again, a reflection on the functioning of the meal system and less on the initial development process at that point.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you. I understand more the question now in terms of the overall process rather than just the finalization of the process. I think that for us, after the first day, the first challenge that we noticed was that people were still keeping in mind the physical way we were conducting things for the SMILER, and they wanted to behave the same way in the virtual one. And honestly, it was a bit difficult. For example, having work groups were a bit difficult and so on. And finally, at the end of the SMILER session, we got some help, and we noticed that, for example, we use Teams, for example. When physically we have to split into small groups to conduct, for example, their discussion and get back to the main group and discuss with people, share our findings, share our ideas, we noticed that we were not really ready using Teams at that time. But at the end, we understood that in Teams, there is a way to have a main channel that is, for example, the main channel of the SMILER, and that we can have within this main channel now the sub-channels that can represent different work groups that we organize to go and do offline discussions for 10 to 15 minutes and now get back to the main channel and do that discussion. So for us, this really is was helpful for us, and we understood that if we had to reorganize another SMILER workshop that is virtual, we will not hesitate to really structure very well the teams that we are organizing to conduct the meetings, so that we already have the main team for plenary discussions, and we have sub-teams that are already chosen depending on the profile of the people to conduct some internal discussions or group discussion that we have to do. I think that this is one of the biggest lessons that we learned. We learned also that it is good to have the requirements that are even presented at the beginning of the SMILER. We have to present the different requirements and the different, for example, indicators that are expected, and make sure that all the system that we are developing later fits with the expectations that might be one from CRS and sometimes from the donor. And also, this is something that we noticed that it's good to have it very close to look at it. So over, those are the two recommendations that we notice for our future SMILER if we have to organize and take it into consideration. Over.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very helpful. So before we close, I thought we could just take a moment to open it up to questions for any of the presenters. If we have any questions remaining, we can also just take questions and then answer them offline if that would be more appropriate. So we'll give it maybe a minute or so just to see if there are any additional questions, and then we can wrap this meeting up.
I just want to take a moment to say thanks to the whole CRS and M&E team for sharing all of these really good recommendations. Even though we did a dry run, I still learned a whole bunch more this morning. That was great.
Yeah, I think it doesn't look like there are any other questions, but I just wanted to say, if you could go to the next slide, just echo that sentiment from Lloyd. I think it's great that everyone from the CRS team took time to present. I learned a lot, especially, yeah, Lloyd mentioned it's true. I learned a lot even after doing the dry run and reviewing some of the documents. So it's really great to have everyone from all different parts of the world taking time out of their schedule to present for different members. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you all the people for presenting. We really appreciated it. And we just wanted, there's a quick evaluation that is on the screen here. If you type that into your web browser, it really helps us to enhance future meetings, or you can click on the link that Laura just posted. Otherwise, we look forward, we'll be having our next meeting I think in January is the current plan. It'll be hosted by Bluemont. And so look for the save the date and agenda to come probably in a couple months, but we'll keep everyone apprised of how the group is going. So again, thank you for coming. Thank you to the presenters for presenting. It really was a great presentation.
Thanks, everyone. I think on behalf of the CRS team, we're really pleased to exchange with you all and hope to continue exchanges of good practices in this regard. So thanks a lot for the opportunity.
And yeah, if you want to turn on your camera just to see what people look like, we always like doing this at the end of meetings, just to, because this is a community and it's not just a virtual. I mean, even though it feels like we're just a bunch of faces on the screen, it's always nice to see different folks around the world and see who we're working with. So,
yeah. Hi from Beirut, Lebanon.
Oh, hi, dude.
See you all next time. Keep coming to these meetings. It is quarterly.
It's my first time
Yes.
I joined, but it's very interesting. Thank you. I will join the next one.
Good.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of the week. Stay safe.
Thank you, everyone.